Hi everyone, welcome to my devlog. As you can see, quite a few things changed. I did a new sky. I wanted to add some more detail, some nebulas. I think it looks quite good. And it works very well with the space dust that I added, which I would just say is gas and little debris floating around, because I don't think the setting will have an atmosphere. And I also added additional animations for the player model. The animations are a stand-in for now. I only added a walking animation and it looks a little funny at this speed. And if I go into the aim mode, you can see that I also have sideways walking. And jumping is working as well, and there's some blending between the jumping and walking. I changed the way the animations work to be quite similar to the behavioral tree and state machine that I use for the enemy AI. I use the animation tree node that Godot provides, and then I am essentially adding a bunch of animations on top of each other and blending between them. So the animations for walking are spread out in this 2D space with the forward and backward and left and right animations on the grid and an idle one in the center. So if my character moves forwards, you can see that forwards animation is used 100%, and if I move to the right animation is used. And of course they can be blended, which looks a little weird, but in practice it's working quite well, or at least well enough. And I can also add jumping animations to that. So there are different states, which is of course the starting and landing animation, and then an air animation, which has a feet wiggle a little. I might modify that later, but it seems good enough for now. And then for the upper body, I have another set of animations that I can blend between. So this is the idle animation for holding the gun. This will be when walking around while not aiming. And I can transfer that to be the aiming animation. And you can see there's some weirdness happening in between, but I can fix that later. And aiming works in a similar way. It's a one-dimensional space where you can basically go from 90 degrees down to 90 degrees up. And I can change this value based on the angle that the player is looking. This, in essence, is a combination of a state machine, an animation state machine, and behavioral trees. So you can see there are transition nodes. These are basically state machines. And then I have a tree-like structure on top. And these blend nodes will blend between subtrees. And the result is what you can see here. Aiming up and down, and the walking animation and jumping, everything working properly. So currently all my animations are split into upper and lower body actions and then blended together. And it is working, but I am wondering if there's a smarter way to do it, because for certain actions, the way they blend, as you saw before, it can produce some weird issues with the hands not doing exactly what you expect. If anybody has any suggestions, then I'd be more than grateful to hear them. But otherwise, I presume I will just do some more research and see how this is usually done to try and improve the result. But at least this is closer to what I want to have in the end. The scale is correct and the timings are reasonable, and the blending between them based on input works well. Another thing that was probably obvious to see is the little white bar on the back of her model. This is a health bar. So if I go and show some of the enemies, these turrets I added, for example, once you get hit, you can see that the health bar is indeed decreasing. Nothing happens when the health bar reaches 0, but it is working. And I also added an indicator on the gun. You can see this little cylinder. And every time I shoot, it will build up. And at some point, your gun will be overheated and needs to cool down before you can continue shooting. And also changing the weapon, as you can see here, will lock your gun for a while. So I made the cylinder yellow in that time. And I also added a bunch of particle effects when the bullets hit things. So you can see there are little impact clouds by the bullets. And if I change to the pistol, I also added this new explosion animation and particle effect. And the explosion damages you and enemies as well and pushes you back. The effects can use a little more work, but it's definitely an improvement. In general, for this week, I worked on a lot of things that improve the game feel. So being hit and hitting other things should have some feedback. And if I return to these expanding enemies that I showed off last week, you might be able to see that they have different effects depending on where I hit them. So for example, on the lower part, there would be a regular effect, whereas on the weak point, there would be a different colored effect, so that the player will get some visual feedback on how much damage they are dealing. And there's also an effect for an armored area, but I don't have that in the game anywhere, so there's nowhere to see that right now. Another thing I improved is navigation for enemies. I added a nav mesh in this area, and I made these chaser enemies use the nav mesh for navigation. So you can see they are not getting stuck behind columns, but instead try to circle around. And this even works on the ramps. So if I go up this ramp, then you will see that the enemies will follow me in an intelligent way. And they might get a little stuck, but it is fun. And of course, taking damage has nicer effects now. So I added a blur, screen shake, and I changed the overlay from last week to look a bit less sharp and more like you are actually bleeding, which I think is working quite well. So then we get to this third enemy that I made for this week. And basically they are aiming at you and then shooting a volley. I have a reference to the previous position of the player stored. The turrets will fire their volley in an arc that is based on the previous player's position. So you can see that they are using that. And if the previous position is in some way invalid, then they will just use the up axis. So they will not do anything that looks wrong or broken. And it inadvertently turned this part into quite a bit of a bullet hell level. I'm not sure yet if I want to keep that, but I do think it's quite cool. They have quite a long range, and I definitely need to add a check for vision, if they can actually see the player, because I don't think they should just be blasting away at nothing. That kind of breaks immersion a bit, in my opinion. And as a follow-up to last week's episode, where I was talking about cameras and aiming issues. So if I shoot here, I will hit the point that I expect to hit, whereas if I shoot in the distance, it also works. But if I shoot at a point right above the edge, it isn't immediately obvious why it is hitting this point. So let me try and draw out the problem that we are dealing with. So if this is the terrain, and we have our player standing somewhere here with a gun, then the camera is not here where the player is, but actually somewhere here, looking this way. So the aiming direction is straight ahead like this, whereas the shooting direction would be straight ahead like this. So then if my crosshairs in the game is in line with the red line, that would be very frustrating, because to hit anything you'd have to aim above the player. And also this is not a 2D space, but instead has a camera that has perspective as well, which complicates things further. So what do? If there is an obstacle in the way, like let's assume this wall, for example, then I will do a raycast from the camera until I hit that obstacle, and then draw a line from the player's gun to that obstacle, and essentially this light blue line is what we end up with. This would be the trajectory of the bullet. So now maybe you can see where the issue arises. If my camera is looking down at the ground, then the player's gun will hit that point on the ground. But if the camera is looking just beyond the ground, then I have two options. Either the bullets go parallel to the direction of the gun, in which case they will hit the ground here, and they will not end up where the crosshairs is, which is frustrating. Or I could make the gun aim towards the end of that line, which I can define as, for example, the maximum range of the gun, in which case we get some result that I showed last week, where especially if you have a situation where the gun has a long range, this could lead to very unexpected results. So my solution is a bit of a workaround, and it's not a perfect solution, but it seems to work much better than before. If there is a target under the crosshairs, it works as before, where the final destination of the bullet will be that point. If there is no target, so in this case, I will pick a point that is 20 meters from the camera. So let's say somewhere here, if that is about 20 meters. And that will give some offset. This is also incorrect, of course, because the bullet will not end up where you expect. But for the effective distances with which we are dealing with, it feels a lot better to have the bullet track a point at this kind of distance. So now if I do an arc like this, it doesn't feel very jarring anymore, which I think is a big plus. And the majority of enemies that you want to shoot should be about 20 meters away, so kind of at this point at the end of that ledge, which seems a reasonable distance. And this also improved aiming at rockets quite a bit. So that is what happened for this week. I think the majority of the base systems are in place now, and I should really get to making a level using the enemy types I have, and then working on additional assets and textures. And I think once I have some semblance of a level, I can decide what's missing and which things I need to add and what needs more work. But yes, I'm very optimistic and really excited at how it's going. Progress has been very steady. I'm still very motivated. So that's great. Until then, have a good week, and I'll see you soon. Thank you for watching.